Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to dismantle a myth today. Outsmarting others isn't about being more intelligent in the traditional sense. It's not about IQ or pedigree. It's about understanding the systems that drive human behavior, including your own, and using them with precision. Total dominance is not aggression, it's mastery, and mastery is repeatable, learnable, and scalable. Let's start with the nervous system. Everything you think, say, and do is filtered through it. If you can control your nervous system better than others can control theirs, you've already won the first battle. Now, let's get into the 5 rules. Most people try to influence the outside world before mastering their own. This is backwards. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning and strategy, shuts down under stress. But if you can regulate your breathing, vision, and posture, you regain executive control. You stay calm when others panic. That's how dominance begins, with physiological control. Attention is the currency of influence. If you can guide where people place their attention, you control their perception of reality. Use strategic silence, eye contact, and deliberate pacing to take command of the room. Frame the conversation in terms of value. Whoever sets the frame wins the game. Most people go through life reacting. Something happens and they respond. Their mood, tone, decisions, all of it gets hijacked by the environment. They assume this is normal, but it isn't optimal. It's not how the most effective people operate. Those who consistently outperform others in negotiations, leadership, decision-making, or conflict don't rely on reacting. They operate from a position of control, not external control, internal. The truth is, your ability to think clearly, to strategize effectively, to communicate persuasively, all of that depends on what's happening in your body, not just your brain. Your brain doesn't operate in isolation. It responds to signals coming from your heart rate, your breathing, your muscles, and even the angle of your spine. When you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, when you're physically tight or breathing shallow, the brain reads that input as danger. It shifts your mode of thinking. Your ability to plan or anticipate drops. You become more emotional, less precise, more likely to act impulsively, and less likely to notice subtle information. Now think about this in the context of competing with others. If you're in a meeting, a debate, or even a negotiation, and you lose access to the part of your brain that handles logic and foresight, you've already lost, not because you're less intelligent, but because you're not in the right mode. And the other person, if they've trained themselves to stay composed, calm, and clear, will always have the edge. They're not smarter, they're more regulated. That's the real game. It's not about knowing more facts or having a higher IQ. It's about keeping the parts of your brain online that allow for strategy, patience, and control. And the way to do that starts with your body. If you can consciously control your breathing, lengthen your exhale, slow your inhale, you signal to your brain that you're not in immediate danger. That signal opens the doorway to better thinking. The same is true with posture. Standing or sitting in a more open, grounded stance changes the neural information flowing into your brain. A hunched, collapsed posture feeds the brain a narrative of defeat. A strong, upright posture feeds it one of clarity and readiness. This isn't motivational fluff. It's physiology. Your nervous system is reading data from your body at all times and adjusting your perception of the world based on that. So if you don't like how you're responding to pressure, it's not about forcing a mental change. It's about sending different physical input. That's what the elite athletes, military operators, negotiators, they all train themselves to be in control of their system before trying to control anything outside of them. That's how you outpace your competition. Most people show up to conflict or challenge with their system already in disarray. They're anxious, fatigued, distracted. They're trying to think their way out of chaos while their body is still broadcasting chaos. It doesn't work. What works is creating internal stillness. Not passive stillness, active stillness, the kind that comes from managing your energy, your breath, your attention. When you can maintain that under pressure, you operate on a completely different level. You see things more clearly. You hear what's not being said. You find space to think between words. You notice patterns that others misreact. You don't just react, you choose. This is what most people never realize. In moments of high pressure, the real competition isn't the other person across the table. It's your ability to remain fully present and composed while everything around you wants you to be distracted, tense, and reactive. If you can do that, you don't need to be louder. You don't need to be aggressive. You don't need to know everything. You'll win simply by being the only person operating from full cognitive capacity. And that happens when your internal system is aligned. So if you want to outsmart anyone, don't start with tactics. Start with the mechanism that controls your thinking. Train yourself to stay composed when others can't. Learn to master your own system. Because when you do that, you don't just react better. You think better, speak better, and lead better. You gain an advantage that can't be faked and can't be taught in a textbook. It's earned through practice. And once you have it, you won't just be harder to beat. You'll be impossible to match. In every interaction, whether it's one-on-one or in front of a group, there is an invisible force that determines who holds the advantage. It's not status. It's not knowledge. It's not charisma in the way most people define it. It's something far more subtle and far more powerful. It's about where attention goes and who is guiding it. Most people enter conversations unaware of how fragile and reactive human attention really is. They assume that people are tracking information logically, weighing facts and arguments, listening with intention. That's not how the brain works. The brain isn't a passive receiver of data. It's a filter. It edits out almost everything, and whoever can shape that filter, even slightly, controls the perception of reality in the moment. This doesn't happen through force. It doesn't happen by dominating with volume or intensity. It happens through precision. Human attention is easily pulled toward novelty, contrast, and emotional salience. That means small shifts in tone, in tempo, in where and how you speak can dramatically affect where another person focuses and what meaning they extract. Most people speak without guiding the spotlight. They let it drift uncontrolled, and they lose people in the process. But those who understand how fragile and manipulable attention really is don't just speak, they conduct. The first aspect of this is understanding that people don't just listen to what's being said. They listen to how it's being said and when it's being said. Silence is often more powerful than speech. Pausing just before delivering a key idea sharpens attention like a blade. People lean in, they anticipate. And that anticipation primes them to absorb what comes next. Those who never pause lose that edge. They keep speaking, hoping their words land by volume, not by targeting. It doesn't work. Visual attention also matters. Where you look and how you hold someone's gaze shapes how seriously your words are taken. If your eyes dart or shift too frequently, you signal uncertainty, even if your message is strong. But if your gaze is steady, calm, and purposeful, you anchor people. Their nervous systems begin to regulate toward yours. And once that happens, they become more receptive, not because of persuasion, but because of coherence. People follow coherence. They follow the person who seems most certain about what reality is. There's also the matter of pacing. Most people speak too quickly. They rush, not out of urgency, but out of discomfort with the space between thoughts. But in that space, that controlled tempo is where power is felt. Slower speech with deliberate timing forces others to align with your rhythm. And when you control the rhythm, you control the processing. People begin to think in your cadence, not their own. That subtle shift gives you a psychological lead. You're now dictating not just what they hear, but how they internalize it. Framing is another aspect most overlook. Before any facts are shared, before any logic is laid out, the frame is already being set. The frame is the context that determines how everything else is interpreted. You can present the exact same piece of information under two different frames and get two completely different reactions. Most people default to the other person's frame. They answer questions as they are asked, accept the implied rules of the discussion, and operate from a defensive posture. But the person who subtly adjusts the context, who redefines what the conversation is really about, takes control. They no longer have to react. They've now positioned themselves as the one defining the territory. All of this, pacing, eye movement, silence framing, operates below conscious awareness for most people. But that's the point. When you guide attention deliberately, others rarely notice what you're doing. They just feel more focused on you. They find you more compelling. They trust what you're saying more, not because you've convinced them logically, but because their attention has been anchored to your signal. And where attention is anchored, belief tends to follow. This is why the most effective communicators, they're the ones who make others listen the most. They don't demand attention, they direct it. And in doing so, they gain influence before a single argument is made. They create the conditions for agreement, for persuasion, for impact, all before the content is delivered. If you can master this, you'll rarely need to push. People will start to follow your lead without realizing why. Not because of dominance in the traditional sense, but because you're the only one in the room who seems to know where to place the spotlight. And when everyone is looking where you want them to look, you're already in control, quietly, effectively, and completely. One of the most misunderstood aspects of dealing with people is the assumption that they are unpredictable, that their behavior is random, driven by emotion, impulse, or chance. But in reality, the opposite is true. Human behavior is highly patterned. It follows loops, often unconscious, that repeat across situations, relationships, and decisions. Once you begin to see those loops, you gain an extraordinary advantage, because when you can anticipate what someone is likely to do, think, or feel before they do, you no longer need to overpower them. You simply need to steer them. Subtly, quietly, without resistance. Most people don't study it. They listen for what's being said in the moment, and they react to that surface level data. But beneath every statement, every gesture, every reaction, there's a structure. People reveal far more than they intend. In how they speak, in what they avoid, in what frustrates them, in what lights them up. These signals are clues, and the person who pays attention to those clues, not once, but over time, begins to build a model. That model becomes more accurate the more it's observed. Eventually, it becomes predictive. There is enormous leverage in prediction, not in a flashy way, but in a calm, quiet, strategic sense. If you know someone tends to deflect when they feel cornered, you can present challenges in a way that feels expansive instead of threatening. If you notice that someone always seeks validation after presenting an idea, you can use that need to position your influence without resistance. You're not manipulating. You're operating with foresight. You're adjusting how you interact based on the person's natural flow, rather than forcing your way through it. This requires patience. It requires restraint. The impulse to react immediately is what most people fall into, especially in high-stakes situations. But if you can withhold your immediate response just long enough to see the pattern forming underneath, you will always make smarter decisions. Think of it like a chess game, where your opponent keeps making the same 3 openings. The less experienced player sees the pieces, the seasoned one sees the habits, and habits are where control lives. Once you begin to recognize these patterns, you can also begin to shift them, slowly and perceptibly. You start to mirror someone's language so they feel seen. You subtly reframe repeated complaints as opportunities. You anticipate their hesitations and address them before they arise. This isn't about manipulation. It's about precision. It's about knowing where the energy is likely to flow and placing yourself in the right spot so you can guide it. This becomes especially powerful in groups or organizations where most dynamics are shaped not by the loudest voice, but by the most attuned one. The person who can see which behaviors are reactive, which ones are calculated, and which ones are simply repetitive is the person who knows how to influence from the inside out. They don't need to assert dominance because they're already playing a different game. They're not reacting to what's in front of them. They're operating on a timeline that most others haven't even noticed. The key is subtlety. People resist force, but they almost never resist being understood. When you can predict someone's response and you choose not to exploit it overtly, but instead to guide it gently, you earn trust, even as you take control. That balance between direction and discretion is where long-term influence is built. You're not just winning a moment. You're setting a rhythm that others fall into without noticing. This level of strategic clarity only comes when you step back from content and focus on structure. You're not interested in what someone says once. You're interested in what they always say when certain conditions are met. You're not focused on a single reaction. You're observing how they return to the same coping mechanism when pressure is applied. And once you begin to see those loops clearly, you stop getting caught in them. Instead, you become the person who can stay ahead of the moment. The one who responds instead of reacts. The one who sees the direction something is going before anyone else even knows movement has started. And when that happens consistently, you don't just gain an edge. You redefine the environment itself Because when others are trapped inside their own patterns and you are free to move among them, you're not just playing better in any interaction. People focus heavily on the words being said. They listen to arguments, stories, phrasing, and logic. But what's often missed is that meaning doesn't just come from what's being said. It comes from how it's being said, and even more so from what's not being verbalized at all. The body is constantly sending out signals. Small, precise cues that communicate authority, uncertainty, confidence, anxiety, clarity, or doubt. These cues are not optional. They're constant. And whether you're aware of them or not, they're shaping the way others experience you. People instinctively read these signals. They can't help it. Their nervous system is wired for it. Long before language existed, humans relied on subtle movement, tone, and rhythm to communicate intent. That wiring hasn't gone away. It's just been layered over by modern communication. But it still runs in the background of every conversation. And in high-stakes environments, the influence of those signals only increases. When stakes are high, the brain becomes more sensitive to threat and ambiguity. In those moments, it stops listening to content and starts scanning for cues. It wants to know, is this person safe? Is this person strong? Is this person in control? Those answers come not from vocabulary, but from presence. One of the clearest examples of this is tone. A calm, steady tone can carry more weight than an entire speech filled with clever words. When someone speaks with a grounded cadence, it creates a regulating effect. Others begin to match that rhythm. Their internal tempo begins to slow down and synchronize. That shift is not just psychological, it's physiological. The auditory system connects directly to parts of the brain responsible for safety and vigilance. So when your voice projects steadiness, others not only hear it, they feel it. And once they feel it, they become more receptive to what you're saying. This applies not just to tone, but to pace. People who rush their speech often signal nervous energy. It doesn't matter how intelligent the content is. If it's delivered too fast, too breathlessly, it creates tension. The listener's brain mirrors that tension. On the other hand, when you speak with measured tempo, leaving intentional pauses, you send a very different message. You're signaling that you are in no rush, you're in control of time, and that subtle message changes how people perceive your authority. Then there's the matter of posture and movement. The human eye is extremely sensitive to motion, even at the edge of awareness. Small fidgeting, shifting weight, or restless gestures can signal anxiety or lack of control. In contrast, someone who remains still, only moving when necessary and doing so with purpose, communicates something entirely different. Stillness, when chosen, is a form of power. It communicates control over impulse, comfort in presence, and certainty in purpose. People trust that without always knowing why. Eye contact, too, is more than a social norm. It's a neurological regulator. Direct but relaxed eye contact sends a signal that you are not intimidated, not distracted, and not insecure. It doesn't need to be constant. In fact, too much can be aggressive, but well-placed eye engagement calibrates the entire interaction. It's a cue that says, I'm fully here. I'm not avoiding. I'm not hiding. And that single cue shifts how seriously people take your words. What's often missed is that people make decisions not just based on logic or emotion, but based on coherence. They are drawn to individuals who are aligned in expression, whose facial expressions match their tone, whose posture matches their message, whose presence feels congruent. That coherence is rare. Most people leak tension, doubt, or overcompensation through their nonverbal behavior, even as they try to assert confidence with words. But when everything aligns, the voice, the gaze, the breath, the stillness, there's nothing to hide. And when there's nothing to hide, others lean in. They listen more closely. They assign more value to what you say, not because of the words alone, but because the delivery signals conviction. This doesn't require theatrical training or artificial behavior. In fact, forced performance tends to collapse under pressure. What matters is awareness, being aware of what your body is communicating and bringing it under conscious control allows you to shape the interaction far beyond what words can do alone. It's about understanding that people aren't just listening with their ears. They're watching with their nervous systems. They're picking up on signals, however subtle, that tell them whether to trust, to follow, or to push back. When you understand that, you start to communicate on a deeper level. You no longer rely on persuasion through content alone. You become the message. And when the message is embodied, calm, precise, congruent, others don't need to be convinced. They simply respond. Because deep down, their biology recognizes what real presence feels like. There is a common misconception around high performance. Many people assume that success comes from always pushing harder, staying up longer, doing more. There's this cultural narrative that domination belongs to those who never stop. But the human system doesn't work that way. Biology has limits. The nervous system, the brain, the decision-making circuits, they all rely on cycles. Not constant pressure, but rhythm. And the individuals who truly stay ahead, not for a day, but for years, are those who understand how to manage their internal resources just as precisely as they manage their actions. What most people interpret as burnout, fatigue, or lack of motivation is often not a lack of drive at all. It's depletion. Cognitive systems have energetic requirements. Your brain isn't just a thinking tool. It's a biological organ with specific needs. When it gets overloaded without being replenished, it starts to make errors. It becomes emotionally reactive. It takes shortcuts. It seeks comfort over clarity. And in those moments, your judgment declines even if you think you're performing fine. That's the danger. You don't always feel your decline while it's happening. It shows up later in the form of regret, reactivity, or missed opportunities. Those who truly dominate long-term don't make the mistake of treating their body and mind like machines. They understand that performance doesn't come from force. It comes from alignment. When your system is regulated, you can absorb information faster, respond with clarity, and maintain composure under pressure. But when you're constantly drained, you're not in command. You're just surviving. That's the difference. Most people try to outthink their exhaustion. But the most strategic individuals know to step back, reset, and come back with full cognitive capacity. That's not weakness. That's how you win sustainably. This isn't about taking time off as an indulgence. It's about knowing that your sharpest insights, your most strategic decisions, and your clearest perceptions often come after you've allowed your system to reset. Think of your brain as a processing engine. The more taxed it is, the more it will rely on default settings, familiar patterns, short-term rewards, reactive behavior. But after recovery, the whole system changes. You start seeing options you hadn't seen before. You become less emotionally entangled. You gain perspective. People often confuse urgency with importance. They believe if they're always busy, they're always advancing. But being in constant motion doesn't mean you're making meaningful moves. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is a pause, not to do nothing, but to realign, to let your sensory systems re-regulate, to allow your attention to defragment. When you do that, the next decision you make isn't just faster. It's cleaner. It comes from a deeper place that isn't distorted by fatigue or emotional residue. Sleep plays a role in this, so does light. So does movement. These aren't lifestyle tips. They're biological mechanisms. The systems in your body that govern alertness, focus, and learning rely on inputs from the environment. Morning light calibrates your internal clock. Physical movement primes your body for cognitive engagement. Sleep consolidates memory and clears metabolic waste from the brain. When you neglect these, your system doesn't just slow down. It breaks alignment. Your timing gets off. Your instincts dull. And the person next to you, the one who's been treating these things as non-negotiables, begins to move ahead without pushing harder. They're moving smarter. This is why some people seem to have a calm intensity about them. It's not because they're born with it. It's because they've built a system that supports it. They're not operating on willpower alone. They're pulling from a full reservoir, and that fullness shows up in how they think, how they speak, how they handle pressure. They're able to stay composed because they're not scraping the bottom of their resources. They're managing energy like a strategist, not a gambler. The irony is that when you do this consistently, people begin to think you're just more talented. They'll say you're sharper, faster, more decisive. But what they're really seeing is recovery turned into advantage. It's not superhuman. It's simply being one step ahead by staying one layer deeper. Instead of constantly trying to catch up through force, you stay ahead through clarity. In the end, those who ignore this principle burn bright and fade fast, but those who honor the rhythm of their system who know when to surge and when to restore, are the ones who stay in the game longest. And the longer you can stay in the game at a high level, the more inevitable your dominance becomes. Not because you push harder than everyone else, but because you know when not to push. And that's what separates a moment of strength from a lifetime of control.